actividad. Así que por mientras
Todavía.
se pueden ir subiendo. Buenas tardes.
Hola, buenas tardes.
Arturo, ¿cómo estás? También saludos.
Buena.
¿Qué tal?
Todavía. ¿Quién más? Danilo también. Vanessa.
Bien. Muy bien, ahí les pedimos a todos que cuando empiece la conferencia apaguen los micrófonos, cierren los micrófonos, ¿cierto?
Eduardo Alarcón. El delfín. Nuestro.
Muy bien. Démonos un minutito más. So Roger, this is a series of conferences on different topics, and it's very interesting because I realized that the public changed a little bit. So we have a lot of new faces today. So I say hello to all the new faces, new names for myself. I guess that we have some students today, probably. So that's very interesting too. Anyway. Francisca, es todo tuyo. La profesora Francisca Reyes, entonces, del Instituto de Desarrollo Sustentable, recientemente creado en la universidad, va a liderar y conducir esta actividad. Así que damos la palabra a Francisca y muchas gracias a todos por venir. Francisca.
Gracias, Juan. Estoy viendo ahí también comentarios que nos mandan alumnos que están, así que bienvenidos a todos y voy a pasar a presentar ahora entonces en inglés por el profesor Bilke y todos los que nos escuchan. Entonces, hello to you all and welcome to this, that is the 11th conference of this annual conference series on applied ethics, which is an interdisciplinary initiative of the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile aimed to promote teaching, research, outreach connections, and especially ethical deliberation on problems of urgent global importance, such as climate change, data science, and human rights, among others. We have today the pleasure and the privilege to greet Professor Roger Pielke, Jr., a well-renowned academic that, in his words, study and write about the messy and complicated places where science meets politics. Professor Pielke holds degrees in mathematics, public policy, and political science. Before joining the faculty of the University of Colorado, he was, for almost 10 years, a scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and since 2001, he is a faculty member of the Environmental Study Program of the University of Colorado. Professor Pielke teaches and writes on a diverse range of policy and governance issues related to science, technology, environment, innovation, sports, and more recently, health. He has published extensively, and as a declared follower of his work, I have to specially recommend his groundbreaking book, The Honest Broker, Making Sense of Science in Policy and Politics, published by Cambridge University Press in 2007, a work he has continued to expand in books, articles, and a clever and sometimes provocative newsletter called The Honest Broker Newsletter, which I also highly recommend. Today, Professor Bilke will offer his reflections on the lessons of COVID-19 for science, policy, and ethics in a conference that is scheduled to last around 40 to 45 minutes. We will then have Professor Ernesto San Martin to react to this presentation in about 15 minutes to then offer the ground for questions to the public. So without taking any more time, I give the floor to Professor Bilke. Professor.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. Let me share my screen. Well, hello from Boulder, Colorado. It's still summer here, feels like summer outside. My talk today is titled The Honest Broker in Practice, which is the working title for the sequel to The Honest Broker, which I wrote more than a decade ago. And I'm going to give you a little overview of the Honest Broker framework, mainly to give us a language to talk about the intersection of science, policy, and politics. And then I'll go into a little bit of detail on a 19 case study project I'm leading called the Escape Project on science advice around the world in the pandemic. And Chile is one of our cases. So I'll start with this cartoon. This appeared in what's called the New Yorker magazine soon after Donald Trump was elected. And I use this with my students to illustrate some of the complexities involved with expertise in democratic decision-making. We all think that the pilot who's trained should be flying the plane, but where the plane goes and who decides how it gets there usually are up to the passengers who buy tickets. So this only scratches the surface of some of the complexities of these issues. So what I'd like to do is just illustrate 4 modes of science and policy interaction. And in my book, I have a theoretical framework and I go into some detail. But what I'd like to do is to illustrate these 4 categories: the pure scientist, the issue advocate, the science arbiter, and the honest broker of policy alternatives, using an extended metaphor. And this one is in London. And the metaphor is, where should we have dinner? And let's say we land in London and we have an interaction with a local person who has expertise on restaurants in London. There are a number of different ways that this interaction could occur. And I'm going to go through all 4 categories. So pure science. The local in London might give to me the dietary guidelines for Americans, seeing as I'm an American and the US government publishes dietary guidelines. Dietary guidelines are supposed to be science-based, but once you learn in the United States that the same agency that publishes the dietary guidelines is also responsible for promoting agriculture and food groups, it becomes very complicated. I actually don't think pure science exists. If Bill Gates gives you $1 billion and you go to an island and cut your internet connection, then maybe you can follow your curiosity. But once we engage with broader society or decision makers, we're no longer doing pure science. And of course, there's an Australian guide to healthy eating. There's a vegetarian food pyramid. The idea that there's some way that science will tell me where to go to dinner falls apart very quickly. Another category is the science arbiter, and this can be thought of as the concierge at a hotel. You could go to the concierge and say, where are the 3 closest pizza restaurants? And the defining characteristic of the science arbiter is an interaction between a decision maker and an expert, where the decision maker asks questions that can, in principle, be resolved empirically using tools of science. There are, of course, uncertainties, disagreements, areas of ignorance in science arbitration, but in general, this is something that we around the world have a lot of experience with and often do quite well. The leading scholar, the dean of scholars on science arbitration, is Sheila Jasanoff at Harvard, whose classic book, The Fifth Branch, explored science arbitration, and she identified and recognized that science arbitration too is often a political activity. The notion that scientific advisors can or do limit themselves to purely scientific issues seems fundamentally misconceived. The advisory process seems increasingly important as a locus for negotiating scientific differences that have political weight. And of course, we've seen this broadly in COVID. The issue advocate, this is another character characteristic of a relationship of a decision maker and an expert. And what makes the issue advocate defines this category is a desire to reduce the scope of choice that a decision maker has. So for example, the local might give me a map of all the McDonald's in London. Maybe they like McDonald's, or they think I'm an American, so I must go to McDonald's, or they have stock in the company. They're not misleading me. They're not giving me false information, but they are trying to compel a particular outcome. And we see this, of course, in elections, when people advocate for a particular candidate. We see this when people have a favorite policy that they promote. Now, advocacy by scientists has long been discussed and debated. This is Philip Handler, who was the president of the US National Academy of Sciences. And almost 50 years ago, he said, we've learned that the scientist advocate on either side of such a debate is likely to be more advocate than scientists. And this has unfavorably altered the public view of both the nature of the scientific endeavor and the personal attributes of scientists. Today, the scientific community is well characterized by many scientists and scientific organizations taking a part in advocacy on issues such as energy policy or climate or COVID. And in some cases, there's good documentation that this does indeed lead to a loss of legitimacy. The honest broker. So the honest broker could be thought of as a travel guide. So perhaps my host in London gives me this Michelin guide to London restaurants. And the idea, the honest broker does the opposite of the issue advocate. The honest broker expands, or at least characterizes, the scope of choice to empower the decision maker to make a decision. One of the criticisms of this honest broker framework is that if you give decision makers choices, that empowers them to perhaps make the wrong decision, as judged by the expert. So what I tell my students in my classes is that at some point, we experts have to make peace with democracy. Is it okay for decision makers to make wrong decisions as judged by the experts? Or should we experts become political and advocate for what we believe to be the right decision? We can talk about some of the complexities there. We are all familiar with honest brokers. If anyone uses a travel website to get an airplane or book a hotel room, these sites function as honest brokers. They give us choices. They don't tell us where we have to go. Now, the framework is based on what's called post-normal science by Funktovitz and Ravitz, where we have situations with conflicting values and increasing uncertainties. And just here's 4 different topics. Economic growth has a lot of uncertainties, but not many conflicting values, because most people and most governments want to see it happen. Climate change has many uncertainties and a lot of conflicting values. And at least here in the United States, abortion politics is characterized by not many scientific uncertainties, but a lot of conflict in values. In the lower left is a tornado, and that's what I call tornado politics, where if there's a tornado approaching, which happens sometimes in central US, most people want to live, and what they want to know is, where is that tornado going? And so these characterize a set of problems which have been called tame problems, which are technical problems amenable to technical solutions, such as forecasting a tornado, versus wicked problems, which are highly complex and characteristic of many issues that we debate in the modern era. COVID is obviously a wicked problem. Now, there's one more category, which I didn't mention, which is I call the stealth issue advocate. And oftentimes experts, and politicians may go along with them, will desire a particular outcome, but they will pretend that it's based in science. So in the United Kingdom, a phrase was coined during COVID called "follow the science," which the idea was that, well, if we just listen to the experts, we'll know what to do. And of course, that is flawed, not least because it doesn't address the fact that people may have very different values. People may interpret science differently. There may be true uncertainties, true areas of ignorance. And what that does, instead of bringing science into politics, what that does is it brings politics back into science in an invisible fashion. So I argue that stealth issue advocacy has the potential to delegitimize expertise. Now, I won't go into the details, but in the Honest Broker, I have a framework for how we might decide as individuals what role to play in what context, and it is very context dependent. These categories reflect situations. They don't reflect individuals. I could advocate for one policy in the morning, and in the afternoon, I could be a science arbiter. And let me also say that the role of science arbitration and honest brokering are best conducted by committees of experts with diversity of expertise and diversity of views. Very rarely do we have a simple situation like, where do I go to dinner? So with that as background, and I introduced that mainly just to give us in our conversation today a shared language to talk about this messy interface. I'd like to talk a bit about the ESCAPE project and some of the lessons from that project. The ESCAPE project is funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation, NSF, and we have teams now we have 19 case studies in 17 countries, and I'm hopeful, we have about half of the cases in one way or another, and I'm hopeful we'll get most of them in by the end of the year. Fascinating diversity of experiences. What we're doing in this case, in this project, is we're not evaluating pandemic response. We're evaluating the role of science advice in the pandemic response. And that's a key distinction, because you can have good advice and bad decisions. You can have bad advice and good decisions, and all of the combinations. And so we're evaluating the advisory capacity in these different countries. And I can give you some of the lessons today. So here's our case studies, at least one on every continent. And I should acknowledge our team leaders. There's about 100 people involved around the world. It's a fascinating and wonderful project. Every day I get to talk to someone in a different part of the world like I am today. All right, so let me start out by saying that expert advice comes in many different forms. We have found it useful to use this three-part framework. First, science advice for policymaking, such as when and how to open schools in COVID. Second is data collection and dissemination, so tracking COVID, its prevalence, or tracking vaccination. And third is a very specific type of expert advice, which is often quite formalized, regulatory guidance. So when a government approves a vaccine, for example. I'll mainly talk about category one today. May have a few comments about two. But again, it gets complicated quickly. And just to illustrate some of the complexities, I don't expect anyone to understand these, but these are simplified visualizations of the science advisory landscape in Italy, the Netherlands, and Japan from the ESCAPE project. And all I want you to get from this is that context matters. So each country has its own structure, its own governance structure, and therefore its own science advisory structure. And also that it's complicated. It's very complicated. And so drawing general lessons about science advisory mechanisms can be challenging, because we have to integrate what we learn in the general with what we know to be occurring in specific locations. And so reading through these case studies, and as they get published, and I hope the first ones will be published in the coming month, maybe, people will appreciate that there's a lot of different ways to secure the advice of experts. So in the United States case, I'll have a flag associated with what case I'm talking about. Interestingly, pandemic planning really began, the modern era of pandemic planning began in 2005, when George W. Bush was on vacation and read a book about the 1918 influenza pandemic. The US response has been very fractured and is lacking overall leadership. So I call it the blind man and the elephant, because there's many different plans and proposals, procedures in different government agencies, but lacking through the entire time has been an overarching framework for pandemic response. You may have seen President Biden propose last week a new approach to pandemic planning. And in his proposal, he said we need a quote unquote mission control. So that's like you would have for the Apollo space program. That won't work. So it will be interesting to see how this evolves in the United States. And I'll say a bit about some of the science advisory failures in the US response. So there was a plan, a pre-COVID plan that was thrown out almost immediately. Donald Trump started his coronavirus task force, which is comprised not of experts, but of political appointees, so people who are loyal to Donald Trump. And that was a disaster. We can contrast that with Japan, which following the H1N1 epidemic in 2009, 2010, actually put together a more serious governmental approach to dealing with pandemics, which has multiple science advisory bodies. In the United States, and I'm still amazed at this, the United States lacks a high-level advisory body, excuse me, on COVID. So what we had under Donald Trump was there's Anthony Fauci, which many people around the world have heard of. He was a career government official, not a political appointee, but everyone else was a political appointee of Donald Trump. So very politicized. So when Joe Biden came in, he has put in a more formalized and centralized structure for dealing with COVID, but there's a recognition, this was just from March, that the United States was poorly prepared for a pandemic to occur. And this extends all the way into the science advisory structure. One example is that the US government, this massive, wealthy government full of experts, lacked any data collection or sharing capability for the pandemic when it started. And so the United States the government relied on a magazine. The magazine is called The Atlantic, which started a COVID tracking project. This is what the authors, when the White House reproduced one of our charts, it confirmed our fears. The government was using our data. For months, the American government had no idea how many people were sick with COVID, how many were lying in hospitals, or how many had died. And the COVID tracking project at The Atlantic, started as a temporary volunteer effort, had become a de facto source of pandemic data for the United States. I cannot imagine a more damning statement about government failure than the United States, with all of its capabilities and all of its expertise, flying blind through the pandemic. It has been a remarkable failure, and it still hasn't been fully corrected under President Biden. And again, the lack of data is not the same thing as a failed pandemic response. It's certainly a failure in expert advice that may have contributed to the failed pandemic response. So in my analysis of the US case and trying to explain why there has been a lack of expert advice, one of the things that I'm looking at is US pandemic planning. And the US, in some respects, has been lucky when it comes to epidemics and pandemics. But in another sense, the United States has been unlucky because it lacked experience that motivated political action to prepare. So what this shows is the mentions of the word pandemic in congressional legislation from 1995 to 2018, and in congressional meetings and reports of committee. So you have H1N1, which was the swine flu, led to a burst of activity. This is when George Bush had his summer vacation. But then things dropped off pretty dramatically after that episode passed. We can also look at what sort of expert advice the US government was getting. So the US government has about 1,000 advisory committees that are called FACA committees. That stands for the Federal Advisory Committee Act. So there's about 1,000 expert advisory committees across the government, and they have a data set with all of their public records. So I searched that data set for the word pandemic. And again, when George Bush paid attention to pandemics, we see this uptick, and it peaked with the H1N1 epidemic. And when that passed, there's almost no references, less than 10 over the past decade per year. So the United States government wasn't asking for, and it wasn't receiving expert advice on pandemics in the years leading up to COVID. The science community itself has an ability to focus attention on what it thinks is important. So if we look at the US National Academies, their reports, how many publications include the word pandemic from 1995 to 2019? Again, there's a peak with the H1N1 epidemic, and then a pretty strong drop off. And to put that in context, another very important topic is climate change. And you can compare the number of mentions to pandemic, the number of mentions of climate change, and clearly pandemic planning was a much lower priority for experts in the National Academy of Sciences. An academic focus. So these are English language publications, books that mention the word pandemic, only in the English language, from 1990 to 2019. And you see a peak about 2005, and then a diminishment of interest. So I would argue that yes, government failed in the United States to prepare and pay attention to pandemics, but I think there's some responsibility that goes to us experts, for not calling attention to issues that we should have known to be important. Now, in the United States, despite the national level failure, many state governments performed well. And so Professor Jessica Winkle, who is at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, is doing a case study for our project of response in North Carolina. And she found a very healthy and well-functioning relationship between state-level experts and state-level decision makers. In fact, North Carolina shares a lot in common with Japan. North Carolina has more in common with Japan than it does with the United States in the success of its state-level response. So here's Japan. Informal processes based on previous experience. One of the things we've learned is that having experts and policymakers have a shared experience builds trust. And it's not simple. Institutions are important, but people are important also. And the Japanese case, which saw a more intense set of disease episodes, such as SARS-1, MERS, H1N1, it led Japan to have a much better developed institutional framework for the pandemic, but it also brought together science advisors and policymakers. And that's in a way that does not happen in the United States. So I have 5 C's, and I'm just going to go through here as I talk about lessons that we're taking from the project. We're still working on how to distill the lessons into something that is meaningful and can travel from place to place. But people have to understand that science advisory mechanisms are complex, they're contextual, they're contested. I'll talk more about that. They're absolutely crucial to decision-making, and they're constantly changing. It's a really challenging environment to actually work in. And I should say, even though I use this language and it's very common, I'm not sure that science advice, the phrase, is the right phrase. I think we need more to be thinking about expert advice. And in the examples that follow, I'll illustrate why that is. So one thing we've learned, and this is everywhere, these are some British examples, but expert advice is unavoidably political. Why is it political? Because people have different values and they see the advice through different lenses, and they want different outcomes. And so this is something that I wrote in The Honest Broker, that you can't swim without getting wet. And you cannot offer science advice without getting into politics. They are one and the same. And so one of the things that one lesson I have is that we need to do a better job. We in the expert community need to do a better job of training experts to understand and operate in political environments. And a lot of times, us experts, the most politics we get are faculty politics. We are not familiar with high-level governmental, national, international politics. And we've seen this. We see this with the WHO and the investigation into origins. Many experts simply weren't prepared for what they encountered. This is a big lesson that comes out of our project, is the need for greater attention to what we're calling shadow science advice. The idea of shadow science advice, it borrows a phrase from Commonwealth countries that have shadow leaders in their parliaments. The idea is that there's a loyal opposition, and that there are experts who are well-meaning, who are outside the formal system, but wish to either complement or add to or contest the advice that the government is offering. The Escape project that I'm leading is shadow science advice. It's advice on advice. No one is asking us. But in COVID, we've seen the rise of shadow science advice around the world, in most places. And I think it's fair to say that in some places, shadow science advice isn't always loyal. It's not seeking to make things better. In some cases, it's seeking to make things worse, either for political reasons, to bring down a government, because they don't believe the science. So this is something that we have to pay better attention to. And one thing that I will be pushing more on is that we need to come up with ethical guidelines for what appropriate behavior of shadow science advisors is in democratic systems. And not because I know what the answer is, but because we should have some shared understanding about what is proper and improper behavior. There are paradoxes. So, and I've seen this in climate up close and personal, but the reality is on many topics, particularly emerging topics like a novel coronavirus, you will find that there are legitimate, credentialed, well-meaning experts who hold different points of view. And the models that were used in the early stages of the pandemic to predict what was going to happen, there was a wide diversity there. We have to understand and learn how to create systems that allow diversity of views and maintain the legitimacy in the eyes of the public and policymakers. Often in science advice, we are quick to demand that scientists speak with one voice and one voice only, so that the public or policymakers don't get the impression that there is uncertainty or differences of opinion. But the reality is those differences exist, and they're legitimate. And we have to create advice in the face of uncertainty and ignorance. Another thing we're learning, adversarial governance. What happens when the principal, the policymaker, has either bad intent or is fundamentally incompetent? So here, this shows on the left, the White House, the Trump White House, was sharing a cartoon on Twitter, delegitimizing their top expert. So this is Tony Fauci. They call him Dr. Faucet because he was leaking to the press. But what do you do when you're a science advisor and the government you're advising has bad intent? It's a very famous news conference that occurred where Donald Trump, I don't know exactly what he was saying at this time, but Tony Fauci was trying to hide his face because he was laughing at how ridiculous it was, whatever he was saying. So what happens in situations of adversarial governance? In democracies, technocrats don't make the decisions. And in my experience, in the teaching that I do, typically we assume that governments want advice, they want good advice, and they expect to use that to try to make good decisions. And I don't think we can make that assumption anymore. Stealth advocacy and misplaced accountability. I mentioned before stealth advocacy. A stealth science advisory group in the United Kingdom called Independent Sage. It took the name SAGE, which is the official government body, and called themselves Independent Sage, which already confuses people, and it has confused members of parliament. There's examples of that. They say, well, we're just following the science. That's their tagline, but they have very strong political and policy views, led by a former government advisor. So that's clearly a stealth advocacy activity that seeks to delegitimize the government and the government advisors. On the other hand, the Italian government took a report from its expert advisors and copied it and pasted it into their policy and said, well, the experts told us to do this, and thereby short-circuiting democratic accountability. The advisors advise and decision makers decide. So when a government simply cut and pastes an expert advisory recommendation and then gives responsibility to the scientist for that, that's what I would call an evasion of democratic accountability. We've seen that stealth advisors and governments have the ability to delegitimize expertise. So in the United States, before the pandemic really started, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, and Dr. Fauci were largely supported and respected across the US political spectrum of Republicans and Democrats. And what we saw is, after concerted efforts to criticize and make fun of these organizations, public trust dropped incredibly, but more so among Republicans. And one thing we've learned is that no pandemic response can succeed when there's a lack of trust. On the other side, we have seen a return to trust under the Biden administration. So US adults who say they trust the federal government to provide them with accurate information about COVID-19. It dropped precipitously under Trump and then went back up under Biden. But again, there's a huge partisan divide. So we have the power in how experts and policymakers interact to destroy or to build public trust. And that's something that we need to pay much more closer attention to. It's not something that's an emergent property of science advice. It is one of the core functions of science advice. So some closing observations. Science advisory mechanisms in many nations were unprepared or ill-equipped to support government responses to the pandemic. Even so, some countries and some regions were able to overcome this and successfully, I call it building the plane while flying it. Excuse me. Science advice has typically been defined narrowly and technically, but policymaking would benefit from integrated policy advice. One thing that we see, and this is common pretty much around the world, is that science advisory mechanisms largely provided advice on public health. But the political split in most countries was between public health and economics, because people are concerned about the effects of shutdowns on jobs and so on. And I have not come across a single case where there's an advisory body tasked with coming up with policy options in an honest broker fashion that would integrate expertise in public health and economics. So that leaves it to the policymaker to do that integration, for which they may not be trained or have expertise in. I think that's one reason why we came to the very polar approaches of lockdown versus no lockdown in many countries. It might be time to retire the phrase science advice and focus on expert advice. And by that, I mean science arbitration, honest brokering, and advocacy. The sorts of expertise we need are typically broader than most people think of when they think of science. We need ethicists, we need social scientists, we need people with expertise in lay knowledge. putting that together requires a broader conception of expertise. It's important to understand that shadow science advice can be helpful or it can be pathological. And we need to know the difference and how to get from one to the other. And policymakers would benefit from a greater understanding of expertise. That's true. But it's just as important for us experts to better understand the policymaking structures and institutions and also the norms of democratic governance. So I see a lot of calls to educate policymakers so they understand science. That's great. Everybody should know more science, but we experts need to know more about politics also. I just want to thank the team members, the leaders from the projects that I drew upon today and our secretariat. And I look forward to having a discussion with you.
Thank you, Professor Pielke. I have 2 pages of notes, so I guess everybody is doing the same as me. I will give now the floor to Professor Ernesto San Martin, who will comment on your very interesting and insightful presentation. Professor San Martin is a faculty member from the math department, and borrowing Professor Pielke's own description, I will say he's an undisciplined professor who is trained in mathematics and statistics, but also studied political science, history, and education, among other subjects. He has had an extraordinary and prolific career. He has published extensively, led several projects, among them the Interdisciplinary Social Statistics Laboratory here at the university. And he has recently been appointed Professeur nommé de l'Economic School of the Université Catholique de Louvain. Professor San Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will share the screen. Oops. Can I share the screen?
Yo creo que, ¿quién es el host?
Ahí Ernesto, ahí.
Sí. Gracias. Thank you. Okay. So, thank you very much. Thank you to Roger Pielke for the nice talk. I have just some slides just to try to have a comment. And the comment is more or less related to what Roger talked about, the distance between what scientists think what is important and what is in reality, at least from a political perspective, important. Okay. And my question, my transparent question is how the honest broker perspective could impact statistical modeling or any mathematical modeling or today data science modeling or so on. Sorry. Oops. Okay. For me, in principle, there are something that could be called an ethical constraint and taking into account an Arendt perspective. When I look myself and my colleague at university, when they are related to policy, I realize that there are a big difference between the thinking activity that is at the end of the day what academicians do and what is related with the what is related to the faculty of judgment or taste. And there are a difference, and in particular in the political realm or in the political world, it's important to have a faculty of judgment, which is not at all related with the thinking activity. And so this explains for me why the policy decision and the actions are not the spring of the expert, nor of their recommendation, but of the statement. But if the statement is, it is encircled by a lot of experts, but where the advice contradict between them. Okay, so the idea is that the expert, the statement or the policymaker has to judge between all these kind of expert recommendations. So this is the first thing that is important for scientists or for academicians to understand. Okay, that we need to enter into other faculty in our mind, let's say, and this is the faculty of judgment. Now, for me, the honest broker of policy alternative, okay, propose a way to try to enter into this faculty, and in particular, to, how can I say, to change the way in which one academic activity, in particular statistical modeling or any data science modeling, okay, can be improved. I mean, in order to participate in the real world. And one of the recommendations Roger Pielke provides to the consumer of scientific knowledge in his book, no, The Honest Broker, is the following: if your policy recommendation is indeed based on scientific results, what scientific information will be necessary to change your policy position? And this question, in my comprehension, can have an impact on the way in which we construct the model, and in particular, in the way in which we can make explicit how to expand the scope of choice for decision making. So, the first things that I emphasize all the time is that the evidence alone is not enough, and this is for me the base in order to say the evidence-based policy paradigm is not enough to make scientific advice. Why? Because in the first statistical interpretation of data is equivalent to say something, some characteristic, or to focus the attention on some characteristic of a population under study, represented by fake data, and this is what we as statisticians call a parameter of a probability distribution, because we, at the end of the day, believe that all what we observe is generated by some probability distribution. The heterogeneity of the reality is, at the end of the day, captured by this kind of entities. But if we only reduce just to make a, I don't know, descriptive analysis or exploratory analysis of the data, it's not enough, because sometimes, and most of the time, and in empirical research, I will say always, we make statements about the population, but those statements cannot be represented by means what we call parameters. And when we have that, we face an identification problem. And I will give an example related to the COVID. So, and this is quality identification problem, and the spring of an identification problem is the connection between statistical models and reality, and as seems told several years ago, such a connection may even be inappropriate. And I will show you in which sense that happens. So where we can open the door in order to expand the scope of choices for decision making, taking into account that conclusion and recommendation always can be or are based not only on the evidence or the data, but also on assumptions we need to introduce in our way in which we try to interpret the reality at the end of the day, or some reality at the end of the day. And this assumption cannot be empirically tested, and that happens always in empirical research, at least in empirical research when we use some statistical tools or mathematical tools or similar tools. Let me give a small example. In the COVID, for instance, one of the parameter of interest, the parameter we want to, I don't know, to focus our attention in order to provide information for the decision making. The infection rate by date D, and we write the probability or the proportion of frequency is the same of this variable CD. This is not directly observable. We can have millions of data, but this is not directly observable. Why not? Because what we observe or what we collect all the days, or a government collect all the days, is on the one hand the rate of testing for infection, let's call TD, and the rate of positive results, let's call RD. These two variables are related to our interest, okay, and are related in this way, okay. So the infection rate is equal to the rate of positive results multiplied by the predictive positive value of a test. This is a characteristic of a diagnostic test, plus this conditional distribution, which is the proportion of persons who are infected among those persons where the result of the test is negative. We don't sometimes, or always, maybe, there are some negative results, but it's possible that the person is infected. And we can decompose all these probabilities, and only the probabilities in blue can be computed for the data, but this is not our interest. And in particular, for policy recommendation is nothing for policy recommendation. But the red one, and in particular, the rate, the infection rate, is what we try to estimate, let's say, but all the red components are not identified. So we can see that it's impossible to identify this infection rate, and so it's impossible to make a recommendation based on that parameter. What can we do? Instead of hidden in a complicated model and to provide some numbers, the idea is just to provide some assumptions and different assumptions. And in this sense, we say, okay, we have a kind of honest broker perspective. For instance, it's possible to find credible to assume specific value for the predictive positive value of the test, the negative predictive value of the test, and to report the infection rate under different assumptions on this conditional probability, namely the proportion of infected person, given that they were not tested. But also, it's possible to assume, for instance, that the infection rate among tested persons is higher than the rate among untested persons. And this is a monotonicity condition that we can introduce in our modeling approach. This is not possible to empirically to prove, but under those conditions, if we are ready to believe those conditions, we can provide a kind of plausible value for the infection rate. Other possibility, because this is a kind of, this is a dynamic event or process, we can say that that a person who has been infected by an early date necessarily has been infected by every later date. So for different, or for this order between dates, we have this probability, and so on. And we can offer, from a modeling point of view, different estimations of the infection rate, but under different assumptions that policymaker needs to understand if they are credible or incredible. And under those assumptions, we can say, okay, I believe to this assumption, so I take into account those assumptions in the final result, and I will act as a policymaker in agreement, not with the result, but in agreement with the assumption I do, and this could provide action in the political world. This is the way in which we think, or we propose, that the honest broker perspective well developed by Roger Pielke, could impact in the statistical modeling, and in this sense, to say, okay, the model are not a kind of, I don't know, revelation that imply results, and these results are took as evidence in order to provide policy recommendation. Just final words from a statistician before, no? Anyone who has tried to make sense to real data will have come across the problem of non-identifiability. And which is the relevance of that? That means that the first explanation of the data is not the only one. And this is important when different explanation, as I try to explain with this example in the COVID, or this example in the statistical model of the COVID, different explanations suggest completely different course of action. Thank you.
Perdón. Thank you, Professor San Martin. I will give the opportunity for some of you who would like to comment or to ask questions. I ask you to briefly introduce yourself and to be brief and concise, please, so we can give the space for everybody to participate. I see the hand of Jean Lafortune.
Thank you, Francisca. And so my question is, you know, I'm a associate professor in the economics department here, and my question is, maybe, you know, economics is a science that has had a longer experience trying to influence policy makers than maybe climate scientists or other things of that sort. But a main challenge is when you're wrong. So if in your Michelin guide, it turns out that, you know, you claim a restaurant is provides healthy food, and, you know, in the next 6 months is discovered that this restaurant has health hazards, your credibility will go down. And so how do we deal with, you know, loss of credibility in the context of COVID? This was, you know, there's some models that were completely off, and then, you know, people had to readjust. How do you, as scientists, deal with this loss of credibility? Should we be afraid? Should we embrace it? Should we say, a bit like Ernesto was saying, well, depends on the parameters, and now you've changed me the parameters. How do we explain that we get it wrong sometimes?
Yeah, it's a great set of questions. And let me say, economics is one of the most well-developed fields where expertise and politics routinely interact in productive ways. Most governments have economic indicators, whether it's unemployment or growth and so on. Part of that is because we have built our governmental, societal, economic systems around contemporary modern theories of economics and capitalism, which facilitates providing expert advice. So economics has a lot of lessons to teach other experts in that relationship. But securing legitimacy and trust is absolutely essential. And what the research I'm aware of says is that being wrong by itself is not necessarily going to compromise legitimacy. And for example, we all have a lot of experience with weather forecasts. And we all know that weather forecasts are not always correct. But day after day, we still look at the weather forecasts. And one of the things we've learned in our research is that experience and understanding of a particular context makes it easier for experts to be wrong, because decision makers in the public can calibrate their experiences against what the expert says. So no one expects a weather forecaster to have 100% accuracy. This is a different situation when we get into something like COVID, where none of us have experience with a global pandemic. And none of us has had experience until January 2020 with SARS coronavirus 2. So we have to be much more humble and approach knowledge with much less certainty than we might with a weather forecast. And so that also has implications, not just for the technical science arbitration, but also for the forms of policy advice that we would give. So with weather forecasting, we can have more deterministic sort of recommendations based on the known skill of a particular technical judgment. In a situation like COVID, we might instead want to have more robust decision-making. That is, recommend policy alternatives that can succeed even if we are wrong in our knowledge. And this is where it's really important to differentiate science arbitration, which might involve coming together and, one answer to science arbitration is we don't know, it's uncertain. That's very different than policy advice, which integrates technical knowledge with values preferences to come up with options. And I would think in situations such as COVID that are highly uncertain, quickly evolving, we need more honest brokering that integrates uncertainties and knowledge with policy options rather than simply trying to provide specific, accurate scientific data, which may or may not survive. And I'll just give you a quick example. In the United States, and I'm sure this has happened elsewhere, I don't know if it's happened in Chile, but there's a debate over the effectiveness of masks. And what the science says. Do masks prevent the spread of disease? Do they not? Why wouldn't we recommend the public wears them if we have doctors wearing them? It's been very confusing for people. Rather than answer the scientific question, a better approach would have been early on to say, well, we're not 100% sure, but our policy is based on better safe than sorry, the precautionary principle. So there are ways to frame knowledge in a decision-making context that contributes to or subtracts from legitimacy. And I guess the last thing I'll say is having experts, credentialed experts out in public arguing with each other doesn't tend to help anyone's legitimacy. This is why it's really important to have formal institutions and fora where we can come together and have debates, discuss knowledge, and then present it as an expert community, not this person in the media, this other person in the media arguing with each other for 5 minutes.
I have a question, may I? I don't know if Professor Lafortune, do you want to follow up? I saw you were...
Oh, just thank you.
You finished your presentation noting the importance of training, not only scientists to understand the policymaking process, but the other way around. We have been focusing on that topic at the university for this year, doing a series of workshops and different activities to try to find out what is the topics in which you could train professors and academics who are willing to give knowledge to the decision makers. And one of the things that we find out is that professors don't necessarily think they should be trained on that issues. They are not particularly willing to be trained. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts or recommendation or experience on how to do that. We have tracked some experiences of that, especially in Canada, New Zealand, and in England, but they are rather scary. In the whole world, there are very few places where you see that. That's my question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I can, for about 15 years here at Colorado, I led a program to do exactly what you describe, which is to train scientists and engineers, primarily. It was open to anyone, but to train, and they were all graduate students, so mostly PhDs, aspiring experts who want to engage in policy. And the training that we provided them, I'll just give you a short list. We gave them training in understanding the institutional landscape. So if you want to provide policy advice at the federal level in the United States, then a first requirement is you need to know how the federal level works. You need to know how Congress works. You need to know how the bureaucracy works. You need to know the federal agencies. You need to know how the money flows. And in any country, whether it's Chile or the United States or China or Great Britain, government is complicated. And understanding how things work on paper versus in reality requires training. Another form of training we gave was modes of interaction. So the honest broker framework obviously is what we use, but to let them know that experts have choices, as do decision makers, in how they engage with each other, and understanding what role might be appropriate and how to identify that is important. We also train them in skills of interaction. So in the United States, if you're privileged, you get 5 minutes to testify. And for most of us academics, we have a hard time saying what we're going to say in a 45-minute discussion like today. So training students and experts to be able to interact and convey a message in 5 minutes, or maybe it's 1 minute. And just as an example, when communicating to policymakers, it's always important to lead with your conclusions. We're trained in academia to say, well, let me tell you about my assumptions, my data, my methods, and then at the end of the story comes the conclusions, and it's backwards in policy. And then I guess the last thing is to understand relevance. Just because we know something or we have expertise doesn't make it relevant to the decision maker. So we have to train experts to be able to place themselves in the shoes of the decision maker, or better yet, to ask them, what information do you need that would be helpful in your deliberations? And I guess the last thing I would say, and this is less training and more awareness, but this is the phrase I use, but it's for experts to make peace with democracy. Just because we're experts doesn't mean that we're going to have more say than other citizens. And once we have provided advice, then the responsibility for decision making belongs to the decision maker, often an elected or an appointed official. Our job isn't to make decisions. If we want to run for office or serve as a minister, then we can do that. But advisors advise and decision makers decide. And so understanding that fundamental aspect of democracy is absolutely essential. So I think we can do it. So my story ends with a sad ending. My university stopped our program because it didn't fit into any one department. Two of my former students were political appointees under Barack Obama. They work in Congress, in the federal agencies. You'd think that would be a sign of success, but we don't fit into a discipline. So there was no support for it. So I do think it's hard. There are places in the United States like Arizona State University, Michigan in particular, Virginia Tech, North Carolina State, that do have very robust programs that I think offer really strong training. But there are, as you say, there aren't very many.
Thank you, Professor. I saw the hand of Patricio Cumci, or te arrepintió.
Patricio Garcia, I work at I'm a professor at the psychology department. I was just thinking well, thanks for your wonderful talk. I was just thinking about also the need to train on the politics, not just the administrative part, because, politicians are politicians and they make decisions not only based on what's best for the public, unfortunately, but also the politics of the decision and how that will impact in their own careers. And in the last year or even before that, we've been seeing that here with some of the decisions that have been made, even though technically they are not, and some of them know they are not correct decisions. their popular decisions in economics and in other areas. So I think that scientists that wants to influence politics needs to understand that, and otherwise you will just hit your head against the wall thinking that they are not making the right decisions, although they know. I just wanted to make that comment, and thanks again for your talk.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. And this is why I think it's very important training people to understand politics is often very hard. It's better to have experts actually serve as if they have a chance to be a fellow who sits in a legislature or can work with a policymaker to see politics happening. And your comment reminded me, there's also media training that we need to provide to experts to understand how to interact with the media. And also, in many cases, experts are there not because of their expertise, because they're a symbol of expertise. A politician might like to have an expert standing next to them just because they can say, here's an expert that's a prop, we might say. So training people so that they aren't misused by politicians is also important. And it's very difficult because a lot of times we all have this, it's a very, we say in English, it's a very heady experience to be at the high levels of government. You feel important, you feel recognized. But we also have to say that you as an expert often have to maintain your independence. And that may include refusing to be used or misused as a symbol of expertise rather than for the substance of your knowledge.
Juan.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Roger, for the nice presentation. Also, thank you, Ernesto, for your approach. So I really enjoy the program that you are running, Roger, this evaluation about scientific advice. But then there is the other question. I don't know if it's part of your program, and it's a very difficult question, is to try to understand or correlate if having a better scientific advice system implicates that you do a better job. You were more successful in the pandemic problem. So is that possible? Because at the end, what people and mainly politicians need is to show that, look, because I have better scientific advisors or better scientific advice system, I did better. So is that possible in your program? Is that part of the program, or that's like a dream that is impossible to address?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And the first thing I'll say is I wish we could answer that question. It's going to be much easier to identify, and this is, I think, common in policy research generally, much easier to identify where failures in science advice contributed to failures in response. So it's kind of the opposite side of your question. That doesn't say that if they improved the science advice, they would have made better decisions. So that's an issue. I guess the second issue is that, well, there's more. The second issue is that there's such a diversity of experience in the pandemic around the world, not only at national levels, but at federal levels and in states, in cities, in universities, in communities, in sports leagues, that a full accounting of success and failure and what that even means in the pandemic is going to take some time. We're going to have to work that out. I can say the easier part is for us inside the expert community to evaluate how well we did, because we don't have to rely on politicians. We have a good sense of what good knowledge is and what a healthy interface is. So I'm more optimistic that we can say something about science advisory mechanisms themselves, but I'm less optimistic we can connect that to larger pandemic responses. And like I say, the pandemic's not over yet, so I don't think we even know, to what degree there was a success. I can say that the higher up you go institutionally, organizationally, obviously the World Health Organization plays an incredibly important centralizing role in any pandemic response globally. And I think there are some really important lessons that we can say, like the declaration of a public health emergency of international concern that triggers a pandemic. We can say that that process needs to be improved in a lot of ways. Whether that would have led to better responses, we could argue about, but certainly there can be some improvements made at the highest levels.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you.
I was wondering if maybe you could expand a little bit on the escape project in Chile, because you didn't mention the Chilean experience in your presentation, and I saw one of the professors working with you is from the Católica.
Yeah, the escape project in Chile. Well, I have a first draft of the report, so I don't want to say too much about what they found, but their high-level findings for Chile are that, and you are all locals, and so you can let me know your thoughts, but that there was advice provided at the highest levels that was in general ignored by decision makers. And also that advice, like in many places, became very contested across the board. And Chile had the unique circumstances of some social disruption and unrest in the months preceding the pandemic, which led to a particularly difficult political environment. I mean, it's never a good time for a pandemic to occur, but in Chile, it was particularly difficult given the circumstances that immediately preceded the events that subsequently occurred.
See, there has been a lot of discussion lately, well, of course, related to COVID, but I'm sure you're aware that our newly created Ministry of Science and Technology, the minister is himself a scientist. So he has made a personal commitment in trying to incorporate, at least in the public debate, the relevance of having experts and science advice into the decision-making process. So COVID was, well, the perfect storm for this framing to be tested, in fact, with the shortcomings that we all know it has.
Well, our evaluation is just calendar year 2020, because we have to stop it at some point. And in a lot of places, obviously, the science advisory mechanisms have evolved and are changing. And Chile is a case, like many places, where the pandemic itself has motivated institutional evolution and creation. In a way, like we saw in Japan after H1N1, but evaluating these new institutional arrangements, number one, it's very difficult because there's no data, they're just emerging. But the real test is if they survive and if they offer some preparation for the next pandemic or do better for the rest of COVID.
Juan, tenías.
Yeah, no, it's more like a comment, but I don't know if Ernesto and Roger can comment on that. But of course, Ernesto introduced this idea that experts needs to put forward the assumptions that they make when they process the data and the conclusions they make. But then on the other hand, after your question, Francisca, Roger comment that when we need to communicate to politicians, we need to go very rapidly. We have a very few minutes. And I think that sometimes, I don't know, sometimes I'm a little bit pessimistic that it's possible to transfer the knowledge with all the details. And then you have the media in between that probably also has to do everything fast. So I don't know. I'm just commenting, and at some point, I was thinking that these two visions are incompatible, and I think that's the challenge. I don't know, because you need to go rapidly, but you need to transfer all the details and all the complications. So I don't know. I think one of the issues in Chile that I think is positive is that scientists are being discussing about results everywhere, but you also realize that they arrive to different conclusions. So I think it's good, but also it's very dangerous, because at some point they seem to be behaving like politicians because they think very differently. And people was expecting that every scientist should think or arrive to the same result. So I don't know, just thinking if how we can take Ernesto's comment and try to introduce these ideas in the way we advise as experts to society. I don't think that we should advise only politicians, it's to advise and transfer knowledge to society. I don't know. Yes, general.
Yeah,
comment.
I mean, this is where I think the practice of honest brokering is so important, because sure, policymakers and the public want to know what we know as experts, but as you say, sometimes it's very complicated. There's a lot of assumptions, a lot of details, there's uncertainties, but more often, policymakers want to know, well, what could we do? What are our options? Sometimes they ask, what should we do? What's the best option? And when we come up with options, we are integrating all of that knowledge, all of the uncertainties, all of the details. And if someone says to me, how do I avoid flooding in Central Boulder? I could go into a long discussion of the climate system in Boulder Canyon and the geology and how water flows and hydrology. Or I could just say, build your house up on the hill, and then you won't have a flood. And so there are different ways to provide advice. And I think, and this is where it's hard for us, because sometimes the best advice that we can give is advice that is robust to uncertainties in our knowledge. And that makes our knowledge less important, and that makes us less important and diminishes our political role. But I can tell you, if I'm worried about rain falling tomorrow, if I bring an umbrella, I don't care about the weather forecast. I don't need a weather forecaster. So diminishing the significance of expert advice sometimes is the best thing that we can do, even though that may seem contrary to our own interests.
I'm thinking, I mean, you said a number of very, very interesting things. I'm sure this project will really shed some very interesting light in these 5 C's. Complexity being perhaps the one that flashes like this. Your phrase, I will write it someplace very big in my office, that scientists needs to make peace with democracy. And for that, again, being a political scientist myself, I always think on the importance of having good and sound institutions, of course, and the importance of democracy that it could never be underplayed. But I think that you offer a perspective of knowledge brokering activities that is so complex and so rich. Of course, this is not only a question and answer game. If we only reduce it to that, it's very simple, because it's how to learn to be giving the short and the fast and the right answer. But it's a much more complex game, which involves, as you said, the framing, the building communities. I'm taking all this from I'm sure you met Professor Martusini, a Viennese professor who works on this. And it's very interesting that also what you present is much more complex than anything that we can think here. We are about to be on time, so I think I will be closing. Or do you have, sorry, Patricio, the hand is up, or it's me?
up, but if we are out of time, that's okay. I just wanted to say that I just wanted to mention that obviously the scientific evidence has a range of certainty, and that's also very important. And that relates to what Juan said before, right? I mean, if you have something that you have conclusive evidence, you can have one strategy to try to influence, but when evidence is, you know, shaky or is the best evidence you have, but still not very conclusive, your strategy obviously has to be different. I just wanted to make that comment. And I'm sorry, at the end of the day, it's still a decision, right? Because when if the evidence is 50-50, let's say the evidence is, you know, 50% or 60-40, you still have to make a decision, right? The evidence sometimes is not, the evidence doesn't speak or doesn't make a decision. You, the politician or whomever, has to make the decision. And I think, of course, as a psychologist, which I am, the decision-making process and what it takes to make a decision-making process is, I think it's, of course, fundamental. The evidence won't make the decision for you.
We have to make peace with democracy and with uncertainty, we can say. In some summary, with life. Professor Pielke, on behalf of the university and of course of the series of conference which is organized, you know, by Professor Juan Larraín, we thank you very much for your time, for your presence here today. And we would like to also thank all the persons that attended today and remind you that we have a next conference on September 21. Again, this series, still we have 7 to run. So thank you very, very much. It was really, really interesting listening to you and a pleasure to finally meet you after all this year reading you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks all for coming and thanks for having me. Great discussion today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ernesto. Thank you, Francisca, also.